I tried 3D printing an entire model at home. In this video I'm going to show you what happened. To do the printing at home, one will need a 3D printer. There are multiple options out there. To be fair, I reject at least one offer for 3D printer review each week, but this one seems just too good to pass. The Gears Ultracraft Reflex is a one-stop production platform, and I'm going to use it to print the B-Wing. Thanks to Gears for sponsoring this video. In this game, it all starts with the digital model. You can choose to do it yourself or buy one from the numerous 3D model marketplaces online. Next up comes the slicing software, which prepares the model for the printer. On top of creating the layers, here we have much more important task: placing the supports and orienting the model in a favorable position. Gears provide their own proprietary slicing software. It has automatic model rotation, placement and supports based on prompts you have to give it. The software and the 3D printing system are equipped with tethering capability via Wi-Fi. With this, the user is able to wirelessly send the model to the printer and after manually starting the printing process to monitor the process via app on his smartphone or the slicer on his PC. First, let's go through the process of bringing the model to life. Then we are going to assemble, paint and weather it. In case you want to go back and forth, I have the timestamps for the different parts in the description. The build platform is quite hefty piece of metal. The way it is designed allows to tighten it or undo it with a single move. The VAT is also interestingly designed. It slots nicely in position and gets secured in place with tabs on each side, instead of the more traditional screws. This setup also has a resin level and temperature sensor. For this build, I'm going to use ABS-like resin. More of my thoughts on it a little bit later. The resin feeding is an interesting process where the bottle gets inserted into the printer upside down and the valve integrated in the bottle opens. The integrated temperature, humidity and level sensor in tandem with the software decides how much resin will be needed for your project and adds more during the printing process if that's going to be necessary. Also, the resin is preheated to optimal temperature if needed. For my first print I used the flash drive as I did not have Wi-Fi. Have you noticed that there are always 3 ways to insert a USB stick? Every freaking time! Something I need to mention is that I am using pre-production version of the slicing software, which only allows 50 microns layer height, while the printer is capable of 25 microns, which will be available in the production version. After the print starts, we can basically leave it alone and come back to pick up the finished parts when it is done. Another good design solution is that the build plate can be placed at an angle, so more excess resin can drip down in the vat. Although the design of the printer allows for pretty much zero contact with resin, when time comes to remove the finished prints from the build plate, it is time to put your gloves on. I like to use tray to put some kitchen towel in to capture any leftover resin. Another suggestion I would make is to use a respirator mask and open a window to vent some of the fumes out. Always take the hazards seriously. Removing the prints from the plate requires some force applied through a metal scraper. The ABS-like resin is remarkably close in properties to the plastic our kits are made of. Compared with the regular resin for SLA printing, the ABS-like remains flexible even after the curing process. This makes it much easier to trim with a hobby blade. After the prints are removed from the plate comes the time for isopropanol bath in the second contraption of this 3D printing system. The washing station from Gears comes with two plastic vessels equipped with drain ports and lids. With the parts in the IPA, the machine starts to move for a user-selected amount of time and RPM. It is important to note that this machine should not stand on the same table as the printer. After the time has elapsed, the full plastic container is to be placed on top of the empty one. The drain gets in the port, and after we let the air into the full container and open the drain, the IPA gets in the bottom container, leaving the parts in the top one. The third element of the Ultracraft reflex system is the curing station, which is also an oven. The parts can be cured with UV light alone, but when that is combined with some baking, it apparently makes them a lot stronger. This can be very useful if you are printing functional parts. The supports removal can be carried out in a few different manners, the most satisfying of which is to rip them off. This, however, is only advisable when the supports are on a hidden part of the detail and the surface has enough strength to withstand the pull. We don't want to break the detail after all. For the more delicate places, it is just like with the sprues on the injection molded kits. I use nippers, scalpel blade and small scissors. With regular resin, it is always better to remove the supports before the final curing. The ABS-like resin allows easy supports removal even after the final curing, and this can prevent damage to the somewhat soft surface when the details are uncured. After the supports are gone, there are always leftovers to be removed. On faces which are visible, I carefully cut them away with the scalpel blade or a chisel. On flat, not to be seen surfaces, I use a file. It creates dust and the part can easily be damaged, so this should be done carefully. To mitigate the dust issue to some extent, I use wet kitchen towel on my workbench, so it can capture some of it. Also, dust mask is a must. Regardless how well you have positioned your parts for printing, there are always going to be unfavorable angles where the layer lines will be more prominent. To eliminate those, I am wet sanding the part with 500 grit sandpaper. With that grit, the sanding process is reasonably fast and the resulting surface is acceptably smooth. To glue the parts together, I used CA glue. 2-part epoxy putty can provide more strength if that's necessary. It comes at the expense of drying time though. 3D printed models usually have less parts than traditional injection molded ones. This makes the assembly quite fast. Just like with their injection molded counterparts, the fit is very dependent on the designer. Here I had only a couple of spots where I used filler. I am not going to show you the filling and sanding as it is not at all boring and we all love the process so much. As usual, painting starts with a good layer of surface primer. Once again, I am using Mr. Surfacer 1500 Black, which will be a good base for the shadows. Also, it bonds well to the resin surface in my opinion. For some time now, I abandoned the paint jar shaking ritual. Instead, I used some handy Tamiya stirring sticks, which are made out of metal. Since I am doing that, I haven't experienced the joy of stuck paint jar lids. After I applied the primer, I decided that some battle damage would only help me to sell the idea of heavily used survivor that has a few battles under his belt. Using a round head chisel, I carved out a few spots on the model. Then I filled the holes with Tamiya basic type putty. Before the putty had any chance to dry, I pushed the end of a paintbrush inside the hole, which forced the putty out, creating a good simulation of molten metal. Building a fictional subject is quite refreshing and liberating, so to speak. I only briefly looked at reference images, to see roughly how the thing looks, and from this point on, it's artistic license all the way. The foundation of colors was a layer of XF53 neutral grey from Tamiya, applied almost everywhere in mottling/marbling style. On a few selected panels, I increased the opacity of the neutral grey by applying a few more layers. I made sure that there is still some of that mottling going on. The next batch of panels received a coat of Tamiya's XF20. The goal of this paneling is to break the monotonous grey surface, and since the set surface is quite extensive on this model, the effect should be nice. The final color for this stage is from Mr. Hobby, H305, which should represent FS36-11-8. Mind you, none of these colors is a claim for authenticity, if such a claim can be even made for such sort of a subject. I'm sharing the colors used in this build in case someone likes the results and wants to know the paints. The next step will be to do a little bit of post shading over the panel lines. For this, I made a mix from Tamiya's XF82 Ocean Grey 2 and Mr. Hobby's H54 Navy Blue. For me, the post shading should be very subtle, because in the next step I am going to blend everything together. In such cases, a heavy-handed post shading will cause issues with the coverage. For the set blending, I made a mix from mostly H451 Calcwise and a drop of X20 Medium Grey. To this mix I added some clear matte varnish and a substantial amount of thinner. The reason being is to obtain a paint that can be applied in layers that have low opacity. Slowly building the layers on top of each other will give me a better chance to catch the best moment to stop. Despite already having 6 colors applied on the model, there is more to be done. For that, first I had to do some masking. As seen on reference images, some areas received a light blue color in the form of Mr. Hobby C72 Intermediate Blue. I am happy that I had to paint that color on, because, in my opinion, every grey aircraft desperately needs a splash of color. Same goes for natural metal finish birds. The blue had to be neutralized in a sense, and for this purpose I added some XF57 to create more faded and desaturated mix. That I applied on the centers of the blue panels, avoiding panel lines, corners and gaps. Believe it or not, here I had to do insignias, which is another splash of color that I welcome. Since the insignias are basically orange Hinumarus, I made my own mask with the stepless circle cutter. It does not get easier than that. To keep the battle-worn theme in action, I used masking fluid, which I applied with a sponge on several areas, carefully. After the masking fluid was dry, I applied the base color of the insignias, life color LC55, which stands for FS12246. Of course, the orange had to be faded too, so I added small amount of life color UA089 Desert Sand. Again, this mixture was applied avoiding the panel lines and so on. After I got the masks off, some of the masking fluid went along, and the rest I got rid of with some pencil eraser and a toothpick. Now the insignias look splendid. A few items will need some detail painting. Again, not an exact science, but you already know the theme of the build. First, I brush painted interior steel grey from AK in an area by the thrust engines, then onto some details between the cockpit and the turbine engine. Mind you, I'm using those terms rather loosely. Using the same paint, I applied paint chips along the entire leading edge of the ship using a sponge. It is not hard to imagine how much debris float around in space during a battle, so I chose to have a front end that reflects such an assumption. The next thing to paint were the thruster nozzles, for which I chose polished metal from Ammo by MiG. The paint I applied with a brush, trying not to make a mess. I'll get back here a little bit later. With the detail painting done, I continued with the weathering. To create sharp shadows around raised panels, I used HB graphite pencil. I had to sharpen it a few times, but at the end those raised panels look better defined. For the rest of the panel lines and other recessed areas, I used dark grey panel line accent color from Tamiya. After the wash was dry, I removed the excess using white spirit on various cotton buds and also with a fine paintbrush where more precision was required. Around the engines I used the black panel line accent color, as usually more grime accumulates in this area. Also added some of that black wash on the thruster nozzles to help the detail pop a bit more. For more popping up I used the dry brushing technique. The paint I applied was an enamel silver of sorts from Humbrol. After all is said and done, on the nozzles, I think they look pretty much spot on for this space fighter. Going back on the raised panels, I gave them some more definition using light grey watercolor pencil. Dipping the pencil in water makes it easier for the pigment to get on the matte surface and stay there. Another benefit of this tool is that I was able to blend it to some extent. I think that this somewhat soft transition from edge highlights to no highlights is quite pleasing and elevates the detail even further. Another use of a watercolor pencil was to apply some grime on the wings, where the kit offers some suggestion for mechanical components and fluid lines. The color of choice was sepia, and the application was nearly identical, but with the goal for more prominent effect. In other areas, I took a more traditional approach. I used oil paint to create effect of dirt accumulation fading away from the leading edge of the panel. The color of choice was Starship Field. In any case, amazing weathering color, but here it was a must. Couldn't go wrong with a Starship Field on a Star Wars fighter. In places that I thought were too clean, I did some stippling with the same color. For the next layer of awesomeness, I mixed a drop of blue-gray acrylic paint, a drop of drying retarder, and a drop of thinner. All of that so that the paint does not dry on the tip of the brush. After a thorough mix, I started applying edge highlights on the smaller panels. It looks a bit cartoonish, but I think it's suitable here. After painstaking application, I went to do some paint distress and superficial scratches along the steel grey I applied with the sponge earlier on. This technique is something that I am not really comfortable with, but I feel that with this build I went one step closer to obtaining some proficiency. The same color I used on the blue parts and I think it turned out pretty good. Some more superficial chipping I did using the light grey watercolor pencil. This time dry and nicely sharpened. This is by far the easiest way to achieve a fine chipping effect. Mind you, it only works on a matte surface. Do you remember the battle damage I did way back when? I painted those with Tamiya's smoke, trying to create the burnt effect after a direct hit. I know space fighters have some fancy shields, but still something must be able to go through under the right circumstances. After the smoke was on, I applied some flat varnish over it. Then, using a graphite pencil, I added the metallic sheen of allegedly molten and mangled steel. Honestly, I have no idea what material could be used for such a vehicle, but since weight is not as much of an issue in space, still sounds right. I completely omitted the cockpit in this video, but I don't see it as a focal point. What I did with it after the black primer was to give it an overall dry brushing with neutral grey oil paint. This was followed by a black wash and highlighting dry brush with snow white. Using the sharpened graphite pencil, I created some graphics in the displays and covered those with translucent colors. I also picked out random items in the cockpit with different colors to make things more interesting. The Rebel pilot figure I found on Thingiverse and printed it at home. After a quick but careful painting, he was ready to be glued down on his seat. The wing axis shafts happened to be the same diameter as toothpicks, so I didn't print those. After gluing the wings in position, I dropped some paint and no one will ever notice. The cabin section I left not glued because I want to be able to rotate it for the pictures. And with that, I think I can call it done. Shout out to Hey Gears for sponsoring this video and providing the Ultracraft Reflex one-stop production platform. It makes printing scale models very easy without too much debugging, and the model making efficiency is very high. Also, I want to express my gratitude to my wonderful Patreon supporters and YouTube members for their continuous support. Thank you for watching all the way to the end, and until next time, may the force be with you, fellas.